When it comes to storytelling in RPGs, few elements leave a lasting impression quite like the companions who share in the player's journey. These characters are more than just allies in battle or quest givers. They are the emotional core of the narrative, a reflection of the world and often a mirror for the protagonist's own growth. Done well, companions can become iconic, shaping how we remember and relate to a game. But when poorly executed, they risk being reduced to archetypes, forgettable shadows that barely scratch the surface of what makes a character memorable. This is why the process of fleshing out companions is so critical, especially in games built on player agency. Beyond their core archetypes, memorable characters require depth, backstories with texture, motivations that extend beyond the immediate plot, and the ability to leave ripples in the narrative long after the credits roll. The best companions feel like individuals who existed before we met them, and who will continue to live full lives when our adventure is done. A well-developed companion doesn't just exist to serve the player's story. They bring their own narrative arcs, struggles, and growth to the table. They challenge the player's choices, question the world around them, and occasionally reveal truths the protagonist might otherwise overlook. These moments of push and pull, of tension and camaraderie, are what makes these characters feel real. Without them, companions risk becoming little more than glorified props, vehicles for exposition, or a handful of quirky one-liners. In RPGs where character-driven storytelling often takes center stage, the stakes for crafting compelling companions are higher. Players aren't just passive observers, they're active participants in the journey. This interactivity creates a unique responsibility for writers to ensure that companions feel multidimensional, with arcs that evolve alongside the player's decisions. But this requires a balance. Companions should feel influenced by the player, but they also need to stand on their own, making choices that are true to their character rather than bending entirely to the protagonist's will. When companions are crafted with care, they resonate with players long after the game is over. We remember their struggles, their banter, their triumphs and losses. They become the kind of characters who inspire fan art, analysis, and even debates about morality and agency. But when companions are left underdeveloped, they fade into obscurity. Forgettable footnotes in a story that could have been so much more. In this analysis, we'll examine two characters who illustrate both the heights and pitfalls of companion design: Dragon Age Inquisition's Dorian Pavus and Dragon Age the Veilguard's Neve Gallus. One serves as a shining example of how to transcend archetypes, while the other highlights the risk of leaning too heavily on them. Through their comparison, we'll explore what it takes to make a companion truly memorable, and what happens when that potential is left untapped. Whether you love him or hate him, Dorian Pavus is a character who leaves no one indifferent. As a Dragon Age's first in-depth glimpse into the world of Tevinter beyond its blood magic and slavery, Dorian brings nuance to a setting often painted in extremes. An Altus from a noble mage family, Dorian is more than just his sharp intelligence and biting wit. He's a character who embodies both the privilege and the rebellion of his homeland. Dorian makes his debut in Dragon Age Inquisition, during the investigation of Magister Alexius and his manipulation of Redcliffe. From the moment he steps into the story, Dorian proves himself as an incredibly capable and talented mage, carrying the weight of his past choices. Alexius, once his mentor and a father figure, represents both a connection to Dorian's roots and a cautionary tale of what power without accountability can become. Dorian's role in the development of Alexius's time magic, a groundbreaking yet deeply dangerous field of study, adds layers to his character. He's not merely an idealist or an opportunist, but a man burdened with the unintended consequences of his own brilliance. Despite his personal history with Alexius, Dorian doesn't hesitate to stand against his former mentor when the Magister's ambitions threaten to upend reality itself. It's in this pivotal moment that we see the heart of who Dorian is, a man of conviction, guided by a moral compass that prioritizes doing what is right, even when it comes at a personal cost. His choice to ally with Inquisition in dismantling Alexius' plan is more than a narrative beat. It's a declaration of Dorian's character, someone who challenges the world he comes from, even as he remains inextricably tied to it. Through Dorian, we're given a richer understanding of Tevinter and its complexities. He's neither an apologist for its sins nor a blind revolutionary seeking to burn it all down. Instead, he straddles a delicate balance, showcasing the humanity within a society so often depicted as irredeemable. And it's this duality that makes him unforgettable, a character who forces us to question the absolutes we've been presented with, and who, in his flaws and virtues alike, feels undeniably real. Dorian is also the first openly gay companion in the Dragon Age series, and his sexuality is an intrinsic part of his story, woven seamlessly into his character without feeling forced or tokenistic. In contrast to the often tone-deaf handling of gender and sexuality in Veilguard, where companions are universally pansexual in a superficial nod to inclusivity, Dorian's narrative explores the genuine struggles and consequences of being gay in a society that demands conformity. His sexuality isn't an afterthought or a checkbox, it's a fundamental aspect of who he is, shaping his relationships, his motivations, and his rebellion against Tevinter's rigid traditions. As the son of a noble mage family, Dorian faces immense pressure to meet the expectations of an Altus. In Tevinter, bloodlines are everything, and noble families cling to the idea of maintaining power and prestige through arranged marriages and procreation. Dorian's refusal to suppress his identity and conform to these expectations is an act of defiance against the very system he was born into. His father's attempt to fix him, a heartbreaking and deeply personal subplot, highlight the intersection of personal identity and systemic oppression. What makes Dorian's story so compelling is that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. His sexuality informs but doesn't define his character. He's not just a gay man in a fantasy setting. He's a fully realized individual with ambitions, flaws, and convictions. His struggle to reconcile his heritage with his sense of self resonates beyond the boundaries of Thedas, offering players a deeply human story of acceptance and resilience. In stark contrast, Veilguard misses this mark entirely. The universal pansexuality of its companions, while seemingly inclusive on the surface, often feels shallow and performative. By refusing to anchor sexuality or gender identity to any meaningful character development, Veilguard strips his cast of the depth that makes characters like Dorian so memorable. Inclusivity isn't just about representation, it's about creating stories that feel authentic, stories that explore how identity shapes individuals and their interactions with the world. Dorian's story works because it takes risks. It acknowledges the pain and alienation that can come from being different in a society steeped in tradition and expectation. But it also celebrates his strength and self-acceptance, allowing him to grow beyond the shadows of his upbringing. His sexuality is integral to his journey, but it's never the entirety of it. This balance is what makes him one of the most beloved characters in the series. By comparison, Veilguard's companions often feel like they exist in a sanitized vacuum, where complex issues are sidestepped rather than explored. Without the weight of meaningful conflict or the nuance of individual experience, the characters fail to resonate on the same emotional level. Dorian proves that representation can be more than just a checkbox. It can be the foundation for storytelling that challenges, inspires, and endures. Neve Gallus is a prime example of how Veilguard squanders potential through lackluster execution. She's such a forgettable character that I almost didn't make this video. Not because she isn't worth examining, but because I genuinely forgot she existed. Like Dorian, Neve is a mage from Tevinter. But unlike him, her role as an independent detective investigating blood magic and corruption among the Magisters is barely explored. On paper, this concept is rich with potential. The murky world of Tevinter politics and the dangerous allure of blood magic should provide fertile ground for a compelling, morally complex character. Unfortunately, Veilguard once again misses the mark, leaving Neve's character feeling flat and unengaging. One would expect Neve, as a Tevinter mage, to encounter distrust or suspicion from characters outside her homeland, much like Dorian did in Inquisition. But Veilguard sidesteps this entirely. Her intentions and goals are never challenged or questioned. She moves through the story without the friction or escapism that could lend her depth or create opportunities for character growth. Instead, like every other companion in Veilguard, Neve is presented as a fundamentally good person, and the player is expected to trust her because the narrative says so. This lack of tension does Neve no favors. In a world as politically charged and morally grey as Dragon Age, companions shine when they're allowed to be messy, controversial, and human. Dorian's journey is filled with mistrust, reconciliation, and the constant push and pull of his identity and his homeland's reputation. Neve, on the other hand, is a blank slate, a character who exists but leaves no ripples in the story, the world, or the player's emotions. Neve Gallus is portrayed as an incredibly competent and well-respected detective. She's a celebrated figure in her field, known for her ability to solve any case and handle even the most dangerous situations with grace. Charismatic, calm under pressure, and undeniably effective, Neve seemingly has everything going for her. But after hours of quests and dialogue, when you're searching for the deeper layers of her character, her fatal flaw is revealed. She wants to be liked. That's it. On paper, the idea of a character striving to be liked isn't inherently bad. It can be a fascinating source of internal conflict, especially when it clashes with their duties or personal beliefs. But in Veilguard, this trait is presented so superficially that it barely registers as a flaw. Neve's desire to be liked never creates tension, pushes her to make questionable decisions, or leads her to moments of growth. It's simply there, existing in the background, a footnote to her otherwise perfect image. This is where Veilguard falters in its character design. A good flaw is a crack in the character's foundation. It should challenge them, force them to confront uncomfortable truths, and ideally make them relatable to the audience. Dorian, for instance, is charismatic and brilliant, but his arrogance and unresolved issues with his father lead to conflict. His flaws make him human. Neve's flaw, on the other hand, feels like an afterthought, a token imperfection slapped onto an otherwise pristine character. Because of this, Neve's story never feels personal. She's a detective solving cases, but her role is more procedural than emotional. We never see her struggle to reconcile her need for approval with the hard choices her job might demand. She doesn't lose anything or risk alienating those she wants to impress. In fact, her flaw is so inconsequential to the narrative that it might as well not exist. Once again, the Veilguard companions feel less like fully realized individuals and more like reflections of the writer's personal struggles. Instead of existing as distinctive characters with their own motivations, flaws, and arcs, they come across as extensions of their creator, vessels through which personal insecurities and experiences are projected. Representation is a powerful tool in storytelling, especially in RPGs, where players often form deep connections with their companions. But there's a fine line between creating a character that resonates because of their relatability, and one that exists solely to validate the writer's inner world. The latter often results in characters that feel one-dimensional, their struggles and triumphs ringing hollow because they don't emerge organically from the narrative. Neve, like many of the Veilguard companions, suffers from this. Her flaw, her desire to be liked, feels more like a reflection of the writer's own insecurities than a meaningful trait that shapes her journey. It's not woven into her story in a way that challenges her or enriches the player's understanding of who she is. Instead, it's presented as a surface-level quirk, disconnected from the high-stakes world she inhabits. This approach not only undermines Neve's character, but also diminishes the player's experience. RPG companions should feel like they have lives beyond the scope of the player's journey, with flaws and decisions that sometimes make them hard to understand or even like. The best characters leave room for complexity in interpretation. They don't exist solely to make the player or the writer feel validated. In contrast, someone like Dorian is multifaceted. His struggles, while deeply personal and tied to his identity, are written in a way that allows him to serve the narrative, deepen his relationships, and spark meaningful discussions. His story isn't just about representation, it's about exploring how his past, his culture, and his flaws shape him to someone worth remembering. As a writer, I fully understand that your lived experiences and beliefs inevitably bleed into your work. That's not only natural, it's often what makes stories resonate. Drawing from personal struggles and emotions can give characters authenticity, making them feel more grounded and relatable. When handled well, these traits can enrich a character's narrative arc and create moments that allow players with similar life experiences to feel seen and understood. However, there's a fine line between using your own experiences to inform a character in a way that feels organic, and slapping your personality and struggles onto them without consideration for the world they inhabit. The former makes a character more human, anchoring them in reality while still respecting the narrative and setting. The latter risks making characters feel disconnected, as though they belong more to the writer's personal story than the fictional universe they're supposed to inhabit. This is especially damaging in a world like Dragon Age, where the setting itself is almost a character. Its rules, history, and restrictions shape everything within it. When a companion's traits or flaws clash with established lore, it doesn't just make the character feel out of place, it undermines the believability of the entire narrative. The player is pulled out of the experience, reminded that this character isn't a product of Thedas, but of the writer's need for personal validation. Take Neve Gallus, for instance. Her desire to be liked, a universal and relatable trait, could have been an interesting flaw if woven into the context of her role as a Tevinter detective. Imagine the tension if this trait led her to make compromises in investigations or struggle with the ethical dilemmas of pleasing the wrong people to maintain her reputation. Instead, it's presented as a superficial quirk, completely disconnected from the darker, cutthroat world of Tevinter politics and blood magic. When a character's personal struggles and insecurities don't align with the world's lore, they don't feel like part of the story. They feel imposed on it. And while representation and relatability are important, they must serve the narrative, not overshadow it. Great character writing means allowing a character to exist and grow within their world, shaped by its rules and constraints, while still reflecting universal truths that players can connect with. Neve had potential, as all the companions in Veilguard do, but that potential is never realized because the character is never allowed to be anything more than a superficial version of their relatable archetype. Her desire to be liked is mentioned, sure, but it's not explored in a meaningful way. It's just a surface-level trait, one that's told to the player rather than shown through her actions, her choices, or her internal struggles. The problem with characters like Neve is that they're treated as perfectly palatable. They are designed to be liked by the player, and that's where the issue lies. A character can have likable traits and still be compelling, but in Veilguard, Veilguard, those traits come across as shallow because they're never tested or challenged. There's no depth to them. Neve's need for approval could have been an incredibly rich source of tension if explored properly. What lengths would she go just to feel accepted? Would she compromise her principles or let herself be manipulated to keep people's favor? How does this flaw affect her interactions with others, especially those who might not give her the validation she craves? If Veilguard had allowed Neve to make decisions that came with real consequences, where her need to be liked affected the outcome of her cases, her relationship with other characters, and even her own integrity, it could have turned her from a forgettable surface-level character into someone memorable. As it stands, her desire to be liked doesn't resonate because we never see her struggle with it. There's no sacrifice, there's no fallout. And so the player never gets to see the full impact of her flaw. When characters' flaws are presented without consequences, it creates a lack of emotional investment. The player never feels like they're truly learning something about the character or their inner world, and as a result, those characters leave no lasting impression. It's a missed opportunity for storytelling. In the end, Neve becomes the epitome of forgettable. If you ask players about the Veilguard companions, you'll hear complaints about Tasha's poorly executed preaching, Belara's annoying childishness, Lucanus' ridiculous obsession with coffee, Hardin's juvenile immaturity, Davrin's preachy self-righteousness, and Emrich's shallow fixation on Aegeon. But Neve? Very few will even mention her. That's the true tragedy of her character. She's so perfectly blunt, so safely written, that she becomes invisible in a cast full of far more divisive figures. She's not terrible, but she's not memorable either. Her sole flaw, wanting to be liked, never gets explored in a meaningful way. It's a trait, yes, but one that doesn't evolve into anything significant. There's no tension, no sacrifice, no internal struggle. Just a hollow desire that doesn't move the plot forward or push her growth as a character. Unlike Dorian, whose internal conflict and identity struggles were integral to his story, Neve's motivations and flaws never extend beyond the surface. Without this depth, she ends up feeling more like an NPC than a companion, someone the player just has to get through rather than someone they truly connect with. The problem with Neve isn't that she doesn't have potential, it's that she's locked in a cage of safety, prevented from ever becoming more than her basic archetype. She's never given the room to grow, to falter, or to challenge her own desires. She never risks anything for the player to care about, which leaves her tragically forgettable when compared to the other companions, for all their flaws and eccentricities. Ultimately, Veilguard is filled with characters that, for better or for worse, make an impression. But Neve doesn't, and in a game where companions are meant to leave ripples, her stillness speaks volumes. If you have enjoyed this deep dive into Dragon Age and want to see more content like this, consider supporting the channel by joining my Patreon. Your support helps keep the content flowing and allows me to keep bringing you more in-depth analysis, lore breakdowns, and character explorations. Plus, you'll get access to exclusive content, glimpses of what goes behind the scenes, and the chance to be a part of a growing community of fellow lore fans. So head on over to the Patreon and become a supporter today. My special thanks to NerdyDude247, Little Dude 901, and John Grant. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay critical, stay curious, and stay gaming.